Hey guys, it's Liam. I'm making Creativity Matters resident history buff. And over the past little while, we brought you all kinds of information about weird festivals and weird facts about films and art from around the world. And today we're going to take a look at a little bit of weird local history. And so these are some odd historical facts from the city of Toronto that go back over the last 100 years or so. And these aren't the ones that made it into the history books. This is the oddball history of Toronto, if you could call it that. Now, Toronto for a long time has been known as a city of parks. We're renowned for our parkland and just the sheer amount of green public space. We've got the islands, Bluffers Park, Rouge Valley, Don Valley. But in Victorian Toronto, this wasn't really the case. Prior to about 1875, there were actually no public parks in the city of Toronto that were available for people to use. The only green space that was available for the working class was cemeteries. So if you were planning a day out in the park, your really only alternative would have been to go for a walk in the cemetery. Mount Pleasant Cemetery was one of them, and there are a few others scattered throughout the city. But it really wasn't exactly the kind of place you could have a fun family outing. So in 1876, when John Howard passed away, he had willed his property to the city of Toronto, which eventually became High Park, as we know it now in the West End near the Humber River. But a stipulation of that donation was that alcohol could not be served in the park, and it could not be used for viceful activities. So that's something that was pretty typical of Toronto of the period, but it has still hung around. So these days, if you're going for a jog in High Park, you still can't get a beer. Back on the subject of cemeteries, we know that nowadays that Yorkville is among the probably the highest valued, most prestigious area of the cities. But in the mid-Victorian period, it was a cemetery itself. The Potter's Field, home to unmarked graves, families that could not afford a proper burial or people that died and were unknown. And even today, pretty well anytime there's a construction project ongoing in the Yorkville area, they still unearth human remains. And as such, there's been reports of hauntings in the area. Take what you want from it, whether or not you're believe in that kind of thing. But as we mentioned earlier, Toronto was generally a very Protestant city 120 or 130 years ago. So we looked into some of the odd laws that have come out of that. And on a Sunday in Toronto, to this day, you are not allowed to lead a dead horse down Yonge Street. How one leads a dead horse down Yonge Street is beyond me, and whether or not it's fair game on Monday through Saturday, I don't know. But that's a law that was put into the history books, and for some reason they never got rid of it. Furthermore, as many older Torontonians remember, the Lord's Day Act celebrated it was required that you would celebrate and worship on the Sunday as opposed to doing any viceful activities, as they suggested, which is basically anything other than worship or family matters. And as such, for about 80 years in Toronto, there was very little you could do on a Sunday. Shopping was outlawed. For a while, there wasn't even streetcar service on Sundays. It wasn't allowed. It was considered to be a nuisance. Many church parishioners complained that operating cars past churches was too noisy and disruptive, so they had to go without it. Perhaps not an unknown law about the city of Toronto, but perhaps most shocking is that it was only repealed in 1992. So until the early 90s, Toronto was a pretty dull place on a Sunday. Now, the next one we have here is one that may or may not be known. Superman actually has a Canadian connection. Joe Shuster, when he started the early models for Superman, was living in Toronto, Toronto-born, and many of the little nuances that one finds in Superman comics and Superman media are actually related to the city of Toronto. The Daily Globe, or Daily Planet, that he works for is actually a direct model of the Toronto Daily Star. And if you look at early models of the Daily Planet building, it's actually modeled off the Toronto Star building of the same period. So little subtle nuances that have been around for the last 80 years or so do reinforce that connection. So that being said, more fun facts coming up next week. Stay tuned for more alternative history of Toronto.